Hi, I'm Dr. Chad Larson, and this is Keep It Real. Keep It Real is all about real talk based on my 20 plus years of clinical experience. What we're really talking about is real food, real medicine, and real change.
By the time we hit our mid-40s, many of us have started to notice the stubborn belly fat, aka the midlife middle. But this doesn't all have to be about bad genes and aging. It could be a really important sign of metabolic dysfunction. Hey, I'm Dr. Chad, and welcome back to another episode of Keep It Real, where we dive into all things metabolic health. If you haven't already, or if you're new here, hit subscribe so you never miss another tip on how to optimize your metabolic health. So today we're going to talk about the dreaded midlife middle, why it happens, and most importantly, what you can do to reverse it. For many men and women, hitting 40 or 50, and sometimes even younger, brings an unwelcomed visitor, extra fat accumulation around the midsection. It's easy to blame this on aging, but the real culprit here is metabolic dysfunction. As we age, hormonal changes, insulin resistance, and inflammation really all conspire to bring down our metabolic health. And this could really lead, and probably is the main focus and main reason, that we start to store this excess belly fat. But don't worry, just because you've hit your 40s or beyond, it doesn't mean that you're stuck with this forever. By understanding what's going on under the surface, you can start to make really targeted changes that will help you shed this belly fat and improve, most importantly, your overall metabolic health. So let's dive into the key 5 factors that could be causing the dreaded midlife middle. Key point number 1, hormonal changes. As we age, there are definitely changes in our hormonal imbalances. As women go through perimenopause and postmenopause, there are definitely fluctuations in hormones like estrogen. As estrogen decreases over time, fat starts to redistribute, and that redistribution tends to lead to an increase in belly fat. A very similar thing happens to men. In fact, there's a technical term called andropause. Sometimes we, commonly call that menopause, but it's a real thing. And testosterone can definitely drop down as men get older, and that can also influence excess amount of visceral adipose tissue, aka belly fat. But let's not also forget about a really key adrenal gland hormone called cortisol. Cortisol, I think, is kind of unfairly characterized as a stress hormone. It's more than that, and shouldn't be totally vilified. But for a variety of reasons, there can be an excess amount of cortisol production. And excess amount of cortisol production can cause excess belly fat. So these kind of hormonal changes are really key. So some things to think about in this category is, first of all, get your hormones evaluated by somebody who is very competent at evaluating hormones, taking a comprehensive evaluation of hormones, because each hormone kind of can influence the other. And there's a whole hormone symphony that needs to all harmonize together. If just one hormone is off, it could actually influence other hormones. So first of all, you want to get a comprehensive evaluation by somebody that knows what they're doing, so that they can help you also balance them on the other end. Some other things to consider is like stress management, which in this category, we think about cortisol. And I think one of the most common and maybe least considered oftentimes with stress hormone cortisol being elevated is sleep disruption. There are other things like job stress, family stress, life stress overall. So incorporating some stress management activities, whatever that might mean for you, doing mindfulness techniques, getting massage, spending time in the sauna, taking a trip out in nature. There's a whole variety of ways that we could improve our overall stress management. It might just be like taking an Epsom salt bath at the end of the day or something like that. So it's different for different people, but stress management, getting your hormones checked, that would be kind of the solution for this first key point. Key point number 2, insulin resistance. As we age, there's definitely an increased chance of developing insulin resistance. The more resistant we are to insulin, the greater fat accumulation that's going to manifest. As the cells become more resistant to insulin, remember, is kind of the gatekeeper of, are you in fat storage mode or are you in fat burning mode? So in insulin resistance, there's an excess amount of insulin production, and insulin, because it's one of its jobs, is going to increase fat accumulation. And especially right there in that dreaded midsection. So one of the key things to really consider in this regard is a couple things. First of all, exercise, which we're going to get to in another key point in just a moment. Developing muscles is very important for glucose disposal and also helping to decrease and improve overall insulin resistance, but also a lower carb diet, or I would like to call it a smart carb diet, where we're getting rid of the fast carb side of the spectrum, things with added sugars, foods made from processed grain type foods. Those are fast carbs, and those are definitely going to eventually lead to insulin resistance. But also the smart carb side or the slow carb side of the spectrum is mostly, let's say vegetables overall. Even some root vegetables like maybe sweet potatoes should be fine. White potatoes, I'd probably kind of put at the junction between fast carb and slow carb. And a lot of people, if they consume white potatoes, they get a pretty significant increase of their glucose, which is going to be followed by an excess amount of insulin production. So getting your carbohydrates from a complex carbs, which would be like, vegetables, nuts, legumes, fruits, those kind of thing, berries, the things on the slow carb side of the spectrum could be rich in carbohydrate, but it kind of drips slowly into their system, and especially if it's managed to a fairly, moderate quantity, then in most people, that's going to be fine. So insulin resistance, key two. Key point number two, really important to get a hold of when it comes to belly fat. Key point number three, muscle loss. The fancy term for muscle loss is sarcopenia. It basically means muscle deficiency. And this is a really important contributor to belly fat accumulation because, like I alluded to just a second ago, muscles are a major sink or sponge for glucose. And being a sponge for glucose, they really help to manage blood sugar balance, including how we control and utilize insulin. Insulin, again, being that really, really important gatekeeper for fat accumulation. In other words, the higher the insulin, more belly fat accumulation, the lower the insulin, the greater chance that you're burning that belly fat. So, and frankly, this starts probably around 30. We really start to lose muscle and we have to fight for it. It doesn't just happen. It's a use it or lose it kind of thing. So the key solution here, obviously, is we have to not only consume the right foods to help promote muscle development, muscle protection, which is basically proteins. Animal proteins have the most, kind of highest density for these important amino acids that help to ignite muscle protein synthesis and muscle maintenance. But also, we have to put a certain demand on this muscle. So this is where exercise in general and resistance exercise specifically really helps us to maintain and protect our muscles so that they're fighting this, constant battle of the body trying to decrease muscle tone and muscle strain, and let's just say muscle integrity over time. So we have to fight that process by incorporating good, healthy, complex proteins and also fighting it with resistance exercise. Key point number 4 is chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation is a pretty sneaky, insidious contributor to excess belly fat accumulation. It's a little bit sneaky because it's a little bit more difficult for everyday person who isn't aware of this to really know that it's happening, and certainly how to mitigate it if they do actually identify it's happening. So oftentimes you have to work with a qualified practitioner who understands how to look for this type of chronic inflammation, and then most importantly, what to do about it to reverse it if it happens to be that chronic inflammation is a contributing problem. But what it does is this type of inflammation really disrupts our metabolic health. And it could really kind of slow down our metabolic function. It can get in the way of our favorite little microscopic organelles called mitochondria. My favorite little organelle in all of our cells, the mitochondria, are basically sometimes referred to as the engine or the powerhouse or the battery of the cell. They actually do so much more than that, but it still is a fair analogy. And the mitochondria are pretty much where your metabolic health starts and stops. Chronic inflammation is very, very destructive to the health and function of the mitochondria. So therefore, chronic inflammation really disrupts our general ability to exchange energy, to produce energy, and that's going to influence in a pretty significant way body fat accumulation. So some things that you can do in this regard is be aware of certain environmental chemicals that might be in certain environmental toxins that can be pro-inflammatory, also toxins inside the gastrointestinal tract. One that comes to mind is called LPS, lipopolysaccharides. which comes from kind of an imbalance of the good guys and bad guys in your intestinal microbiome. That can be a significant influence of this type of chronic inflammation. But also we want to think about diet. This is something that we absolutely have agency over, is the foods that we choose. So think of like omega-3 rich fatty fish, very, very helpful anti-inflammatory diet. This helps to kind of quench the kind of inflammation that builds up. Even using high omega-3 EPA fish oil can be very helpful. Getting a good variety of like fruits and vegetables, the thing that give all of our produce their brilliant colors. These are really powerful antioxidants. As the term suggests, antioxidant basically means anti-oxidation. Oxidation is another term or another, kind of subtype of this chronic inflammation. So if we can, on a fairly regular basis, consume some of these foods that are rich in antioxidants, it can help to buffer or reduce or quench some of this oxidation, chronic type inflammation. So that's key point number 4. And key point number 5 is lack of sleep. So you might be thinking, how could lack of sleep cause me to accumulate more belly fat? Well, here's the reason. Lack of sleep has pretty significant influence on several hormones. I talked earlier about cortisol. We also talked about insulin resistance. As we have disrupted sleep, the body is going to release more cortisol because that's kind of a stressful event, stressful situation physiologically for the body. And so as what happens with other, stress factors, lack of sleep is a major potential cause of excess cortisol release. We've already established that excess cortisol chronically over time can really promote excess belly fat, excess fat accumulation around the midsection. So sleep is really, really key to affect cortisol. But we also mentioned insulin. Insulin is a hormone. We think of it as just kind of a blood sugar thing, but lack of proper quantity and quality sleep can also influence insulin, that particular hormone, but also key hormones that really regulate our appetite called leptin and ghrelin. We've talked about insulin resistance. Oftentimes running parallel right along insulin resistance is leptin resistance. Leptin gets produced from the fat, which signals to the brain that we are done eating, we are full, and we're no longer hungry. That can get disrupted in lack of sleep. And the signal getting to the brain that says that we're full can be disrupted and could influence us to keep eating. And then on the opposite side is ghrelin. Ghrelin is our hunger hormone that after eating, ghrelin goes down. But this signal can get disrupted with poor sleep, poor quantity or quality of sleep. And so when you have disruption of cortisol, insulin, leptin, ghrelin, this could really lead to excessive eating. And oftentimes what the brain craves in this type of lack of sleep, hormone imbalance situation is going to be more processed type carbs, sugars, that kind of fast side of the carb spectrum. And we already have established that that's a, kind of a fast track to increasing fat accumulation around the middle. So it's important that you really want to protect your sleep as much as you can, really trying to optimize as many components of, kind of proper sleep hygiene. Going to bed around the same time each day is a pretty important one. Try to set aside 7 to 9 hours for sleep, a cool room. Some people like to take a bath to kind of shut the engines down. Be mindful of devices, an hour or two around bedtime. Same thing with lights, overhead lights versus sort of lamp lights. The lower lights, not only lower in tone, but physically down lowered to kind of mimic the horizon as the sun's going down. We want to establish our inside, of the house similar to what's going on the outside. So the body starts to recognize that you're, kind of landing the plane for the day and starting to shut down the engines and to prepare the body for good quality and quantity sleep. So those are a few things to keep in mind for key point number 5. So to recap, the midlife middle isn't just about aging. It's about hormonal shifts, insulin resistance, muscle loss, inflammation, sleep deprivation. So the good news, well, if you kind of do the opposite of these things or kind of the counterpoint to these, manage your stress, have your hormones evaluated, do the proper things to improve muscle tone and muscle integrity, fight inflammation, identify source of inflammation, really try to optimize your sleep, then you could absolutely reverse this process. You can sort of ignite a healthier level of metabolic function and get your metabolism overall working for you instead of against. If you found these tips helpful, please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more videos on how to optimize your metabolic health. And if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments. I would love to hear from you. Until then, keep it real.